All right, let's go ahead and get things started then. It's about 1 o'clock Central Time. First of all, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining today's webinar. My name is Stephen Krutzfeldt. I'm a business process consultant here with CDI. Today's build along is going to be the beginner's guide to autofile workflows. And the idea of today's webinar is to give you the basics so you can go out and start creating workflows that will start to autofile all of your documents into Laserfiche. If you've never been to a build-along before, in a nutshell, a build-along is an interactive experience designed to guide the viewer through the creation and deployment of a common business process. In today's case, autofile workflows. If at any point you need help or have any questions, please post them into the chat box in the little chat window. I will take some time at the end of the webinar to address any questions that you may have. And chances are, if you have a question, someone else probably has the same one, so don't be afraid to use that. Tips for success. First of all, take good notes. Anyone who knows me knows I'm a big proponent of using screenshots also. The more screenshots and notes that you can take, the better it's going to be. You'll be able to follow along easier and then recall what each one of those steps are. Also, don't be afraid to ask questions. As I mentioned, use that questions area of the chat box. Please do complete the survey that goes out afterwards as well. We'd like to take a look at that and see what people are getting out of these webinars. If there's any improvements we can make at any time, or if you have ideas of webinars you'd like to see, absolutely let us know. And also know that this will be recorded. We'll have this posted up on the CDI YouTube channel within the next few days. And also, if you want more detailed or more interactive feedback, we can go ahead and set up an individual session with one of our consultants here at CDI. So today's process is autofile workflows. The intended audience for this webinar is Laserfiche administrators, but also beginners to Laserfiche workflow. Maybe you've seen what workflow can kind of do. Maybe you've even started to build a couple of workflows, but if you have even a very novice experience with Laserfiche workflow, this webinar should teach you some of the fundamentals. So yeah, lastly, anyone curious of how workflows are built? In order to help follow along, you will need to be able to access Workflow Design Tool, the Laserfiche client, as well as the administration console that we'll be working out of each one of those three today. So if you aren't logged into those already and you want to follow along, I would advise getting into those. For our agenda, the first thing we're going to do is create a metadata template in the admin console that will help facilitate where our documents are going to be automatically filed to. We're then going to go into the Workflow Design Tool, create the actual autofile workflow, and then at the end, we'll test everything end to end to make sure that our workflow is doing what it's meant to do. So with that, let's go ahead and get into it. So I'm logged into my Laserfiche environment here, onto my Laserfiche server, and I have already opened up my three different applications, the Laserfiche client, the admin console, and the workflow design tool. And as I mentioned, we're going to begin by opening up the admin console, because the first thing we want to do is create a metadata template that will be assigned to our documents that we want to autofile. So that can be found. We have multiple repositories. So if you do have multiple repositories, make sure you're going into the correct one. We can open up that node and then go into metadata management node. And then we have two that we can kind of work with, fields or templates. If you want to create the fields ahead of time, you can create each one of those and then select them from a drop-down in the template list. But the other option is to create a new template, and you can actually create new fields within the template ad hoc as you go. So for today's process, I've decided to go with accounts payable. Several of the meetings I've had lately have been around accounts payable, and so it's kind of at the forefront of my mind. So the first thing we do when we create a new template is give it a name. If you also want to give it some more details like description, absolutely do that. And then we're going to be using the buttons along the right-hand side. First thing we'll have to do is insert a new field. Now, it helps to have kind of a plan set up when you're thinking about auto-filing. First of all, what types of documents are you going to be filing? And then also, what type of information do we want to capture on each one of these documents? Now with accounts payable, most of the documents we're going to be seeing are things like invoices or credit memos or possibly checks or other information around that. But all of them are going to be likely revolving around some sort of vendor. So the first field I'm going to have is going to be vendor name. And when we click tab or go to the next, we'll see that it defaulted to a type of text, which is fine. However, the width is limited to 40 characters. And best practice is to always give yourself a little bit of room. That what if you do have that vendor that is 41 characters? So anytime I have a text type of field, I like to just up it to 80 or more. 50 may be sufficient too, but kind of use some discretion, but just know the best practice is to bump that number up a little bit. So also, I'll want my document type. For most templates, I will have either like a document category or a document type, something like that. This one I'm going to call AP doc type. And this one I'm actually going to make a list. And when you create a list here, once again, we're going to bump our width up, even though we probably won't need it to be higher. But we'll go up and then edit list with this button in the top right-hand corner here. So make sure it's highlighted. And here you can start creating your drop-down options. And I'm just going to keep it short and go with invoice or credit memo. If you want to add a blank to the list, we can do that as well. Also, if it's an invoice or even if it's a credit memo, chances are there's some sort of identifying document number. So I'm going to go ahead and just write invoice number on here. And that one I'm going to keep at 40 because invoice numbers aren't usually more than 8 or 10 digits long. We'll also go ahead and add a date field. And make sure that whenever you have a date field, you choose the data type of date as well. And I'll also want to go ahead and have a total field. That maybe that's information I'll want to sort by. We can certainly run some reports later on that type of information. And similarly, I'm just going to go ahead and keep that at text and limit it to 40. And one thing that we aren't going to get into today, but I've been thinking about bringing up in another webinar is how to actually go through the approval process of documents, that start thinking about that business process. And so one thing I want to add and also encourage you to start thinking about how you can use this in your organization is have a status field. And so that status field then could be things like approved, denied, pending, or processed maybe. That a lot of times when we have things, especially like invoices, maybe there are, we want to make sure that they're connected with packing slips. We also want to make sure that they go through an approval process. Oftentimes when I have this template, we have some sort of status field that will create workflows that'll help move those and route them to the right person for approval and movement, things like that. So again, something to think about. But now that we have our accounts payable template set up, I'm just going to go ahead and hit OK. Create this template. Yes, please. And so now we know what type of documents we're going to be filing. We want to make sure that we have a folder structure that's going to be able to meet those requirements as well. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the client. And once again, making sure we're in the exact same client that we developed the template for. And we have to start thinking about where we want these to go. Now, if you don't already have an incoming scans location, I recommend having that in every single one of your Laserbeach environments. That if you want to have an auto file kick off, we need some place to ingest those documents. Where are they going to come in first? That workflow can be monitoring and looking for that. And best practice would be to have something like incoming scans, where you just bring those documents in and workflow is already waiting for something to say, oh, look, a document came in. Let's move it to where our workflow says to go. Now with accounts payable, we did set up our vendors, and so likely we're going to want to send them to a vendor folder. Although if you think about it, we may have, if we want to make it go through an approval process, we could very easily set up another maybe accounts payable folder that would look something like this. So within accounts payable, you could have things like approved, denied, and pending. And then you could have different individuals within your organization monitoring those and have emails go out or something like that. So something to think about. And then once it's been processed, then send it to the vendor folder. Now for today's webinar, since we're going to keep it relatively short and we want to keep this a little bit higher level, we're going to go ahead and have our workflow send, when it sees that a invoice comes in with our accounts payable template assigned to it, it'll come into incoming scans, and then we want to assign it to a vendor folder. So it'll go into a vendor folder like ABC, and then we'll also have it create an invoice folder or go into an invoice folder if one already exists, which I'm not sure it does at this point. So we have a plan of what type of documents, what the template's going to look like, and we now know where they're going to be filed for. So again, best practice is always to make sure that you have a plan before you go in and start building a workflow. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself having to stop and start and remember where you picked up. So always have an idea of where you want it to go, what you want it to be named, what types of documents, and make sure that you have metadata assigned to it as well. So I went ahead and opened up the workflow design tool, and if you didn't see where I did that, it's this icon right here. And depending on where it comes in at, we can either navigate to the tab that has workflow 1 on it, or if you want to create a new workflow, you can hit this little icon here. It looks like a blueprint with a little star or explosion or asterisk or something by it, and that'll open up this. Similarly, if you're not seeing exactly what I'm seeing, you can change some of the views here by going up to View, and you'll want to make sure that we have the Properties icon here. That's also Control-4, but that'll be really important in configuring. So I'll just go ahead and hit Control-4 again, make sure I have that. And similarly, you can bring up the different tools over here, or the toolbox is what we call it. And you can bring that up by clicking on the toolbox icon, or otherwise, I believe there's a toolbox or Control-3, or select it from View. But this is what you'll want to be seeing. Now, before we start building, the first thing we want to do is give our workflow a distinct name so we have something that can differentiate it from the other workflows we're building. So since this is going to be an accounts payable type of workflow, I'm going to call it AP, and then what type of workflow and short description of what it does. In this case, it's going to be an auto file. And we can give it a detailed description of exactly what it's going to do. So anyone else who comes in can say, oh, so this is what this workflow is doing. And then you'll need to make sure that your connection profiles are set up. Now, the way we'll do this is we'll click on Manage Workflow Connection Profiles. And if this is your first time using it, you'll need to go ahead and add one. So if you click on that, we'll be able to see that you'll need a name of what you want to call this profile, probably just workflow. You'll need to identify which server you're going to be using. Hopefully there's a drop down there, which repository you want it to interact with, and then you'll need a username and password, preferably a workflow maintenance user, or at least a user who will have access to change metadata, have access to the whole repository, and can file new documents and do everything that your workflow will need to do. Now in my case, I actually can copy this from an existing user that I've already set up, LF Financial workflow. You'll see that it's already being called LF Financial. We already have our server or local host server selected, and knows which repository and our username and password. If you want to make sure that this is all still up to date and correct, you can hit validate and see it's successful. Now it's very important to make sure that that is working correctly, because if it's not, then the workflow is not going to operate correctly. So once we have that, the next thing we want to do is start building our workflow. And one thing that was a little bit tricky for me when I first started this is that I wanted to kind of put the starting rules first. I basically wanted to find some way to drop in how this is going to start and begin. And so by bringing those documents into the incoming scans location, I wanted to have that in the workflow. But unfortunately, that's not how it's set up. We have to assume that we're going to be doing the starting rules after the fact. So we have to kind of start with step 3. Once the workflow sees that a new document has come in and it has the template attached to it, what do we need to do with it then? And the answer is almost always retrieve the field values off of the document. So if you don't see this at the top, which you probably won't if you haven't used workflow, go ahead and search in the toolbox here for retrieve and find this. It looks like a little blue box with a yellow and black question mark. And all we did was just dragged it over and dropped it into the right at the top here. And what retrieve field values does is it reads the metadata. So that's why we created the template first, is that we need to tell workflow some information about what we're bringing in. And the best practice is to always give the activity name something that's going to differentiate it, that you know exactly what it's doing. So in this case, I'm going to say that it is retrieving AP fields. I'm just going to clear that out. Next thing you'll do is click into this box. It says click here to select which field values to retrieve. And if we open that up, we'll see that there are a lot of different fields that we can choose. These are all of the metadata fields. Now, since we know that all of our AP documents are going to have the same template, we can just use the template dropdown to select our accounts payable template that we created, and then just select all of those. We may not use every one of them, but I always select all just in case I need them. It doesn't hurt anything to grab more than you need. And then the last piece here is if you want to use this activity to look at the field values of something else besides the starting entry, and when I say starting entry, I mean the document we bring in that's going to trigger this, then we can say other entry and point to it. But in today's workflow, we're going to be looking at the starting entry. So once we have our information, now we can tell it to move it. So if you type in move into our search box up here, we'll see move entry. And this is what's actually going to file the document to a different location. Once again, best practice always to give the activity a name. So I'm going to call it move to vendor folder. That way, if anyone else comes in behind me and wants to know what each step is doing, they can see very clearly what each activity does. And you have a choice here. You can create a copy or create a shortcut of the document, or you can move the actual file that came in. And I'm just going to move the whole file. Then it's going to ask me where. Where do you want to move this to? And if you use the token picker, you can select a token that we grabbed or a field that we grabbed earlier. But we can start things off actually by clicking on this box to the right, these three dots, these ellipses, and it'll open up our repository and just be like, why don't you show me where you want to move things to? So in here, we want to go to vendor, and then we want to move it to the vendor folder that's the document is associated with. However, we can't really choose a vendor right now because we don't know which vendor it belongs to. So we know it goes this far, so we go ahead and hit OK there. And the next thing I want to do is, this is where tokens come in handy, and this is why I also wanted to create the template first. So if we click on this greater than sign, and then we go to token dialog, we want to open that up, and then you'll have a window pop out here. And this is our path. So our path is saying go into this repository, the one we connected to, backslash, another level of folders, vendor folder. So we want to add another backslash to say we want to go one level deeper. And we want to tell it to whatever vendor we select in that vendor name field. Remember when we made the vendor name field at the very top of the template? We want to send it to a folder that has the same name. So what we can do is minimize the global tokens. By the way, global tokens, regardless of whatever you are working with, the Laserfish system will just automatically grab the time off of it. It'll show you your repository. It'll show you the path of what's coming in. It grabs a lot of that information, which you can then relate to later. Date's a big one that I use pretty often. But we can minimize those for right now because what we really want is our retrieved field values. So if we expand that, we now have a vendor name. And so if the vendor name is CDI, we can select that, and then it will go to the vendor and then go to a subfolder of whatever the vendor name is retrieved. And then we want to go to an invoices folder. So we can just type invoices after we put in a backslash, and it'll go to those three levels of folders. This would be a good time to take a snapshot, maybe, if you guys are doing screen captures. And we'll hit OK. And so actually, this is done. This is your auto file, that if you just want something that's going to grab information off of a document and move it, that's all you need. Now, of course, we can add different branches if we want to go to different places. And personally, I'm a big fan of always following the move to with a rename. So I'm going to go back into my search and type in rename. And I want to give it a unique name. So that way, all of my files are named something consistently. Yes, you can let individuals name the documents beforehand and just move them, but I find that it's a little bit harder to find if things aren't organized well and they're not always named consistently. So to add consistency, let the system name it for you. So I'm just going to say we're going to rename with maybe doc type and the number. So I'm going to give my activity name, rename doc type and invoice number. And then we're going to do the same thing. We see the little greater than sign. We can go into token dialog. We'll pop this open. And then we're going to tell it what we want to name it. So for each document, we want the AP doc type, and then space dash space, and invoice number. And so whatever the AP doc type that's on that template is, and whatever the invoice number is, it'll name it like invoice space dash space and then invoice number. So we'll just hit OK. Now the last thing we're going to do is track tokens. And this may not mean anything to you right now, but track tokens, it's always best practice to have that at the end of every single workflow. Reason being is, as we're going through this, as this workflow runs, the system's grabbing a lot of information. It's grabbing the invoice number, it's grabbing the document type, but it's kind of keeping those what it sees secret. It won't necessarily tell us if we try and reverse engineer it what it actually saw, unless we say track tokens. That way, when this runs, we can then go back and see exactly what field was grabbed for each one of those. So it gives us an extra level of visibility into our workflow. It's especially handy if you're in a situation like me where you have to figure out why workflows are broken all the time. And so you can go back in and see, oh, well, here's the problem. It didn't name it because it couldn't find the right information. So it's a great way to get that extra window in. Okay, rant over. So I'm going to go ahead and publish this. This is also important. I guess I did that kind of quick. It's just muscle memory at this point. So up here, this green arrow pointing to the top right-hand corner of a blueprint, that's our publish activity. Workflow is not going to run until you publish it. So make sure you click that. And sometimes it takes a second. It's got to figure out everything that's going on. And then a window will pop up that'll ask you, how do you want this to run? Because if you remember, right, like we haven't told it when it's going to do all these activities yet. We need to tell it that, well, we want this to run when a document comes in. There are two ways to make well, technically more than that. I guess there are three ways in order to get a workflow to run. We can condition it, which is what we're going to do here in just a second, where we tell it if these conditions are met, run. We can schedule it to say, over the weekend, or anytime after 5 o'clock, we want you to run this big long workflow. That way it's not bogging down the system while other people are at work. And the other way we can do this is to make this a workflow, a business process, where you can select a document, right click, and then just manually run the workflow on a document, on a folder, or what have you. But for today's example, we want to condition it. And the condition I'm going to give it, you'll notice it automatically gave it a rule name that's the exact same as the workflow name. But this one's going to be create. It's best practice to always name what the starting rule is doing. So create, when a document is created, run the workflow, create AP autofile. It's going to be a condition, not a schedule. We want to make sure the rule status is enabled, meaning that the rule is going to actually work. And then go to next. Now we'll see here that it's going to kick off when the entry is created. we want to get metadata from, make sure that this is selected with the profile that you're using. In our case, it's our LF Financial profile. And then all of these conditions are true, meaning that these conditions, if every single one of them is met, run the workflow. By default, entry type equals a document. Well, that's true. The invoices will be documents, so we can keep that. Add condition, we'll click that button, and then we'll select the green piece. The entry template name is what I'm going to go with, equals, and then we can select our template of accounts payable. So if it's a document with that template, then run. But I actually want to make it even a little bit harder for it to run because I don't want it to run every single time something's created, maybe in another location. So I'm going to add another condition that says entry type, entry path equals, or we could even say begins with, if there are multiple levels. So if you have a incoming scans that's one layer down or one level down from the other folders, then you would want to say starts with, but in my case, mine's at the root, so I'm just going to say equals. So entry path equals, and we'll use our 3 ellipses here to say equals this, incoming scans. And now, very important, last one, always, 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 whenever you're creating starting rules, user does not equal whatever your workflow username is. In most cases, or many cases, if CDI helped you set it up, it's going to be WF or workflow. So we try and keep it consistent that way. Reason for this, runaway workflows are really bad and they can really bog down your system. And a workflow can actually invoke itself. That if you say entry is moved or entry is changed, and the workflow is at any point changing things, it'll change something and then go back and say, oh, something's changed. I need to start the workflow over again. In which case it'll go down, change something else, and say, oh, look, it changed, and so on and so forth. So user does not equal workflow. Very important. Make sure you write that one down. And publish and finish. So now what we've done is we've said that anytime a document comes into, a new document is created in the incoming scans location, workflow will say, oh, look, all of my starting rules are satisfied. I will retrieve the field values that I'm supposed to, and it will find the doc type, invoice date, invoice number, status, and so forth. And then based on that information, it's going to move it to the vendor folder, then to the vendor name, then to an invoices subfolder, and rename it with the renamed doc type and invoice number. So let's see if it works. So we're in here. We want to make sure we're on incoming scans. I'm going to minimize this and minimize that. And I actually have an invoice here. I'm just going to drag and drop it. It'll ask us which template we want to use. We'll use accounts payable. And today's webinar is brought to you by CDI. And it's going to be an invoice, and the invoice number is 7284, which is my birthday. You can write that one down too. I like hot sauces and socks. And the total is going to be $100, and the status we're going to say is pending, which doesn't mean anything yet, but we can use this. We'll just hit OK. And now if everything works the way it's supposed to, we shouldn't even see the document come into incoming scans. That its workflow is already recognized everything's satisfied, and it should already move it. So yep, it's gone. So if we go down into the vendor folder, we'll see that there's a CDI folder there. Actually expand it here. Oh, it did show up there. Okay, so we'll go to CDI, open that up. We'll see it created an invoices folder because it didn't find one. And that's actually another thing that we can set at the workflow level, that the destination, if the path does not exist, create it. You can also just have it break the workflow or terminate the workflow rather if it doesn't find it. But in my case, we know where it wants to go, so we'll just create the folder as we go in. If we open it up, there's our invoice, and 7284. So we can open up, see the metadata. We also saw that text was generated, so we can search by text now. We can actually see the invoice, and all of our metadata came in just fine. So now individuals go in and say, all right, it's been approved. And then so we can have another workflow that's monitoring if this changes to approved, move it to ABC location. So you can start seeing the process. So with that, that's pretty much completes the webinar. If you are interested in learning more, please visit these resources. Laserfish Answers, I'm always going on and on about how great Laserfish Answers is. It's our user community location. So chances are anytime you Google a Laserfish question, it's going to direct you to an answers post that somebody else brought up. It's been up for many years, and chances are if you are running into an issue, someone else has had it before and somebody else has answered how to fix it. So it's great. Also, the Solution Exchange is another good one, as well as our own city's digital peakportals.com. Feel free to check that one out as well. There's a lot of great documentation on everything that is Laserfish related. Fill out the survey for a chance to win an awesome CDI copy mug. And like I said, we certainly do take all of your posts seriously, and we're always looking for new ideas for these webinars, ways that we can help you out in your Laserfish journey. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions. I usually like to keep it to about a half hour, but we've got more time. So any questions you may have, I'll answer at this time. Okay, so the top one, or the only one at this point, looks like how slow are workflows and can they potentially cause slowdown or a crash? The workflows themselves are very, very quick, very fast. You saw that the workflow in this example kicked off and moved and did everything it needed to before it even had a chance to populate in that folder. So workflow's quick. When you run into problems is when you're dealing with a lot of different documents or a lot of different folders or a lot of data all at once. One that we'll typically do is we'll take existing documents and either need to update the metadata by pulling in information from an external table, or maybe you want to rename all of your documents so they all have the same consistent name or something like that. Anytime you do a search and say, I want you to pull back 8,000 documents and then rename each one individually, that's when it'll start to bog down and slow down the system. Oftentimes, though, we'll also have workflow residing on a separate server, though, so you try and keep everything separated so it doesn't bog down any of your daily activities. But I guess that's a really long-winded way of answering the question by it depends. But anytime that you're doing something simple like an auto file, it'll be instantaneous and you won't even know it's running. All right, what other questions do we have? It was a good group of attendees today. I hope you guys got a lot out of this. This was one of the first workflows that I learned how to build, and I thought it was a great kind of introduction into how workflow is working and like how you can kind of use it in the way everything's kind of put together. It's a good first step, so I hope you guys enjoyed it. Remember also that this is going to be saved to the city's digital YouTube channel as well. So we'll have an access there. All right, looks like we have some others here. This window is just kind of a terrible way to view things. All right, how do we access the workflow designer? I remember it being through, to answer your question, how do you access the workflow designer? The workflow designer will have to be installed on whatever server you're working from. So if you're working just from your normal PC, chances are you may not have access to it, that it often resides on the Laserfish server. So if you're not seeing it, chances are you will need to get access to the Laserfish server in order to find that. Okay, through some sort of VPN connection, exactly. All right, and I'm not seeing any other questions. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is there on the screen, steven.krutzfeldt@cdi.support. Also, just www.cdi.support is a great place where you can go in and if you want to request time for one of us to work with you directly, we'd be more than happy to do that as well. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you everybody for joining. Really appreciate it, and we'll see you next month.